Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Wendy Smith. I'll tell you all about Wendy in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that focuses on what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment that we exert for others. And when you do it as a leader, as you'll very much discover that Wendy is, you do it to bring people together for common cause. So Wendy Smith, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome.
Tom, thanks so much for having me.
Well, great. I want to tell folks all about you. You earned your Ph.D. from Harvard Business School, which is pretty impressive. And you are a noted academic and have taught in many places. And now you are at the Alfred Lerner College of Business and Economics and co-director of Women's Leadership at the University of Delaware. You focus on something which is very exciting, but probably way over my head, called strategic paradoxes. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How leaders and teams respond to contradictory agendas, which I can't imagine never happens, but we'll discover that. So Wendy, and you are the author with a co-author of Marianne Lewis of a brand new book called Both and. And by the way, folks, this book has been highly endorsed. How highly endorsed? Both Adam Grant and Tom, excuse me, I blew that one. Both Adam Grant and Tom Peters have endorsed it. That's rare company. Wendy, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. So,
thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. So this book is heavily researched, decades of research, shall we say, and we live in an age of paradox. First of all, just tell me how are you and Marianne, your co-author, defining paradox? So,
John, I love it. And I just want to say thank you for such a lovely introduction. And the hope is that strategic paradoxes is something that we can get everybody to get their heads around, because we believe that it is something that will allow us to develop better solutions to the problems that we face. And so I love the question. Just by way of definition, I'll let you know where I started on this journey. As you said, I did my PhD at Harvard Business School, and I was studying innovation, and I was studying how the leaders of IBM were navigating this tension between today and tomorrow, between their existing world and, at the time, this new world of technology, which at that time was innovating in this cloud-based world, and how they live in this tension between the existing world, the new world, core and explore, being stable and managing change, when it involves so many different skills and different metrics and different mindsets and different ways of allocating resources, and these things are in competition with one another. And the most effective leaders were able to navigate them by recognizing that these things aren't just in competition, they're also interdependent, reinforcing, they're synergistic, and that the more that we can embrace both of these at the same time, the more creative we get. That's paradox. So the definition is these interdependent contradictions that we see all over the place.
Well, let me add another layer of complexity to see if that matters. We live in a world where fact and opinion are blurred, sadly. Do you see that kind of thinking happen in business as well? Not merely in our personal and political lives. Is it adding complexity to it, Wendy? So.
You know, I'm so glad you said that. One of the places that we've taken this idea, we started with business leaders and their thinking. We moved to thinking about these kinds of strategic tensions in our personal lives, the way that we see it show up in work and family, or show up and we've increasingly been thinking about it in terms of our political polarization and the ways in which our society would be better if we can listen to, engage with, accommodate competing ideas, but don't, and really sit in this polarization, this either or thinking. And that has become a really big problem for us as a society.
Absolutely. And you teach in a business school. So what kind of dilemmas are the business students wrestling with? I mean, they're in with the rest of us. And what do they seek from you as their instructor? So.
Yeah, you know, again, we started out thinking about what these tensions look like for organizations and individuals as they manage innovation. We see this now in the world of organizations and individuals trying to manage sustainability or social responsibility. It's true at the organizational level as we try and bring in social and environmental demands along with financial. It's true for the individuals as business school students as they think about the tension in their work about doing well, making an impact, having a positive impact on the world, and making money. And how do you think about the relationship between those, or being really authentic to who they are and following their passions and following, a career that's going to be advantageous to them? Those are real issues that people are grappling with.
You use the term either or, which is very familiar to us, and that's directly. And so your book, Both and Thinking, hits that right in between the eyes, shall we say. So aren't there, so can we have both and? So,
can we have both and?
Can we? Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a yes and no. And I think importantly, what we say in the book, increasingly people are using this language of both and. This should be a both and, or this language of paradox. We should navigate these paradoxes. The thing that's hard is how. And that's why we wrote the book, is to go a level down to say, it's not just the label and saying this is a both and, it's how we implement that.
Well, the other part of your title is Of Both and Thinking. So I'm guessing you begin with the how, begins with thinking. So how does one begin to develop a mindset of both and up here first? So,
one of the things that we talk about, so I like to use the metaphor of the complexity of people who want to meditate to achieve nirvana. It's really hard. And yet, if you go to any meditation session, they'll say the first step is to start with your breath, focus on your breath. So what we say is that this both and is actually quite complicated. It's an approach that can be really complicated and hard to hold on to. The first step, we say, is changing the question. And what we mean by that is that when we confront competing demands, work and life, today and tomorrow, instead of asking the question of which one should I be focused on, which is an either or question, a trade-off question, shifting the question to say, how can I accommodate today and tomorrow, work and life, stability and change, doing something globally, but also being focused locally? How can I accommodate both?
So I like that, because I've heard that kind of questioning before, and rather than the choices, it's and you use an operative word from, or at least it opened up to me, accommodate. So it's trying to find a balance or an integration between the two. Does that fair, Wendy? So.
Yes, and we like to move from the word balance, which feels very static and feels like you've achieved it, to the word balancing, which is a verb, which is an ongoing engagement. And part of that is because sometimes in this both and world, there's this ideal like win-win moment. And that's what I thought when I first started studying paradoxes. What's this ideal win-win? We talk about it as finding a mule, because the mule is this ideal creative integration between, the horse and the donkey. You bring them both together, you get this better, more stable, more sturdy, but that doesn't happen all the time. Often what happens in this both anding is what we call tightrope walking, which is keeping in the long term, over the horizon, what your goal is that accommodates these competing demands, but making these micro shifts, these sort of small balanced micro shifts. And so in tightrope walking, what that looks like in our decision making is sometimes we're focused a little bit, tonight I'm going to go home from the office early to be home with my family. Tomorrow night I'm staying late. We're sort of micro shifting between these opposing things. We're not overly emphasizing one or the other, because then we fall, but we're micro shifting. And that's the ongoing balancing. We talk about that as being consistently inconsistent.
I love it. I have a little mantra that I call focus on better. And it's my reaction to New Year's resolutions. And it's more of thinking of what can you do better? And you define what better means and for whom or for what, and you design your level. So maybe what that focus on better is a little bit about what you are doing and like incremental change. Does that make sense, Wendy? So
certainly in this tightrope walking, it's incremental shifts between opposing ideas in service of accommodating the both and the both. And every once in a while, you might hit the mule. We like to call it the mule on the tightrope. Every once in a while, there might be this ideal integrative moment that brings these together. But then you're going back to these micro shifts, and you're doing both to get to the both and.
Okay, well, let's take a little step back here for some. So the either or, which is most of us are familiar with it. Why is that problematic, Wendy? So,
John, thank you for asking that question. I love that question. In part, we can only really understand why both and is important if we really understand why either or leads us down a detrimental path. So either or is natural. It's how we tend to think. It leads us to making a clear decision, which is what we want to do. But we, as we've charted this out, what happens with either or is we end up in these vicious cycles down detrimental paths. And I'll give you an example. We talk about 3 different patterns of vicious cycles. So the first is that we get so focused on one side of these tensions that we go down these rabbit holes. We talk about it as intensification. So if we think about work life as a tension, overemphasizing work and we burn out, overemphasizing life and we might start to get bored or want to be more creative with what the things we do. We don't want to overemphasize. But then when we overemphasize one or the other, because we've gone so far, we tend to, what we say, overcorrect. We talk about this as wrecking balls. We sort of go from one phase to the other, and it's so vehement that we go to the other phase that it becomes problematic on the other end. And the third pattern, and I'll just say this quickly because this is what we're seeing a lot of now, is that when we go into either or mindset, particularly when we're in organizations and groups and in our society, we tend to go into an either or, that we get stuck in a group that's all believes what we believe and is appealing to the other side. We talk, this is the essence of this polarization that we were talking about. And we talk about this as trench warfare because we go into the trench, we dig deeper and deeper into our side, and we just sort of peer out and shoot against the other side. But we're not in conversation with opinions that are different than ours to come up with more creative solutions. And that's why either or leads us into some problematic places.
Boy, did you hit the nail on the head when you talk about we each retreat to our own group. And yeah, it is a kind of warfare, sadly. So certainly we see that in societal issues and politics, sadly. And so how do we begin to bridge the gap? I mean, because so often if we are in one group or another, we demonize the others. So how do we guard against that, Wendy?
Yeah, well, when it comes to this trench warfare and polarization, it's really tough. We've been thinking a lot about what that means at a societal level. And in part, we think that part of the solution has to come back down to the individual level. So many of us, at least in politics, we're afraid to talk, and certainly in organizations too, we hide away from talking with people with different points of view than ours because we don't want to offend, or we want to minimize the conflict. And yet, this goes back to starting with a change of mindset. It's importantly for both and thinking, conflict and tension is not a bad word. It's not about if there's conflict and tension, it's about how we use it. So it's not if there's conflict between different groups, it's about how we approach that conflict. Do we approach somebody else with the respect and understanding that you have a different opinion than I do, and I'm interested in understanding it? I don't have to agree with it, but I want to give you the respect to hear it. Or do I approach you as, this is us and them, and I'm going to stay away from you? And if we shift our approach to listening and engaging, not necessarily having to agree, it opens up all kinds of opportunities.
Well, I think that's very important, I think, in an organizational standpoint, putting politics aside, but also with when we are in an organization advocating for ideas or someone, and I have mine, and I think, well, I know where Wendy stands. She's not, I'm not even going to bother with her because she doesn't do that. So would I be doing myself a disservice to be thinking that? And how can I guard against that? So,
yeah, I mean, I think the organizations that we see do this well are the ones that have a culture that say, we are going to open up to alternative points of view. So one of the people that we've spoken to, and a story that I love, is Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever for 10 years, really turned the company around and introduced the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. And that's a plan where he made they made a very strong commitment to environmental and social goals while doubling their profits. And Paul Pullman said to us, I know there's tensions out there. If my team is not surfacing them, I ask for them, I invite them, because I want to set the conditions where we're going to engage with them and use them for creativity. That's a leadership. You talked about the soft skills of leadership. That is a leadership skill practice, to invite in all of these tensions and conflicts so that we can, as a team, start engaging and playing with them.
I think that's very powerful. I've often said that to have dissension over ideas, but not for people. So is that what you're getting to? So.
Yeah. And in fact, what I love about what you just said is that the more that we can agree to disagree and create the cultures where we can listen to one another, the more that we actually create bonds across people, even if and enabling the dissension of our ideas and the difference of our ideas. In fact, these things work again, sort of the people and the ideas work together so that we can enable differences of ideas or I'll say it said differently, the more that we have connection of people, the more we can enable us to surface the differences of ideas.
Great. Now let's circle back to the concept of paradox. So what is a paradox within an organizational framework? Do you have an example of something? So.
Yeah. So here's what's important. So again, we're defining paradox as persistent, interdependent contradictions. That's a mouthful. So what we mean by that, and here's what we mean. People will say, how is a paradox different than a trade-off? Like, is this a trade-off and a dilemma, or is this a paradox? And here's what we have argued. What we argue is that, and this is a little, paradoxes live, lurk, engage beneath the surface of all of our dilemmas. And so here's what we mean. We face issues, dilemmas, problems all the time. The problem of innovating, the problem of managing sustainability. We're actually writing right now about the problem of hybrid work and the tension between work from home work. And each of those are dilemmas that sort of beg us for a solution. But the question is, underneath those, what are these opposing forces, these yin-yang opposing tensions that actually reinforce one another? So underneath the work from home dilemma, for example, where leaders have to make decisions on these, are these opposing forces between accommodating the employee, accommodating the organization. There's these tensions between short-term needs and long-term needs. It's these tensions between being accommodating and being productive, flexible and being productive. And these are the kinds of tensions that don't go away, even if their instantiations are different at the organizational level. Those are the paradoxes. This paradox of, love and hate are two sides of the coin, but they define each other. Cooperating and competing are two sides of the coin, but they inform each other. The more that you cooperate, the easier it is to compete with you. And, so they define each other, they inform each other. Those are the paradoxes.
I liked what you said about the flexibility and productivity. And it's not an either or, it's an and because I've had discussions on this show about future of work and hybrid, and what you may know the work of Callie Yost. She talks about the ideas of one size does not fit all. There's flexibility, and so she would be definitely on the and portion of that, both and. So
yeah, and in fact, what we say is that if we're going to engage as both and thinking, the first step is to look at the dilemmas that we face and surface those paradoxes, and then ask ourselves, as we said, the question, how can we accommodate productivity and flexibility in work from home? How can we accommodate short-term needs of the business and long-term, visions how can we accommodate both of them So then by asking those questions, we generate new options. How could Paul Pullman accommodate both the social, environmental impact that he wants to have on the world through Unilever and the need for profits for the company?
That's actually a time-worn, well, I should say, what's the word? Time-worn paradox within business is short-term versus long-term. And obviously, the example of Mr. Pullman shows that it can be done. The both and thinking does work. And so it's a kind of thing of redefining what's possible. So how would a leader advocate for both and thinking, Wendy? So
say more. Are you thinking how would like let me just say, I'll say it this way. This would depend on, are you the CEO and you're in charge of creating the culture, or the senior leader of the team, or are you someone within the team who's going to inform and enable this kind of thinking on your team? I think it depends on where you sit in the organization as to what sort of spheres of influence, spheres of power you have, and how to use that power, either the formal power you have to create the culture and the language of the team, or the informal power. And maybe yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm glad you broke it down into different levels of leadership, and because that's what's important. It's creating. I see a parallel to this for psychological safety. The freedom to speak one's mind, and I think if a leader encourages both and thinking, it gets people to look at not always defer to either or. Am I on the right track?
Absolutely. Amy Edmondson and I have had multiple conversations about the paradoxes of psychological safety. The fact that what psychological safety accomplishes is creating the conditions for mistakes and vulnerability in service of increased effectiveness and productivity. And so the beauty of psychological safety is that it creates these conditions that inherently address these underlying paradoxes. And you'll see Amy Edmondson was actually the person who wrote the foreword for our book.
Oh, that's what small world. She's quite an influential thinker, certainly for me, and I always admire her work. And so as we go forward, I think it in some ways it's actually what you're advocating for is not abstract. It's very simple and very human, if I will. And that's not to diminish your concept. It's to make it more accessible.
I love that. Again, we meaning Marianne and I tend to be very both and thinkers, and we know this can be a really abstract concept. And in fact, it's an abstract concept we've been playing with as a civilization for 2,500 years. I was just telling somebody that the chapter that never made it into the book, but will make it somewhere because I love, has been how we've tracked this concept of paradox back to Eastern philosophy of Taoism and Confucianism, and back to Western philosophy of Greek philosophers like Heraclitus, and who said the famous idea, no man steps in the same river twice, because they're not the same person. They change, and it's not the same river. It changes its dynamic. In any case, 2,500 years we've been thinking it's very heady. It could be a very heady, very abstract, very slippery concept. And I appreciate what you're saying, because one of the things we've been trying to do in the research we're doing, and certainly in bringing it all together in the book, is to ask that very question: how do we make it very pragmatic for us to take this big idea and inform the dilemmas and the decisions in our personal lives and in our organizational lives and in our big society?
Yeah, well, I think in a way, what you're doing is it's problem solving from a different perspective. It's going at it well, in a way, having your cake and eating it too, but not in a presumptuous sense, but actually working for how can we make this a work for as many people as possible. Is that correct? So
absolutely. And that goes right back to, John, I think your introductory comment, which I love, which is this is a really complex idea, and how can we make it something that is tangible and usable for all of us? I think we tend to have a pretty big, or sort of our goal or our thought is that our society has a lot of problems. This is one really important tool to help us navigate some of these big challenges that we face in society. So it's our greatest hope that we can give people tools that are pragmatic of how they can use this in the problems that we're facing in our personal lives and some of these global grand challenges that we face.
Well, no, I mean, change, as you has been said many times, begins within each of us. And how are we going to change? And so, if we think more holistically, both and rather than either or, then maybe we have a chance to bridge some gaps here. So, in writing the book, what would be a takeaway? One or two takeaways you want people to come away with? So.
Yeah, and John, I think you've pulled out so many of them in such a rich and valuable way. So I would just stress, I think there's maybe three. The first is that when we're in this either or mindset, there's a better way. How could we get to both and? So the first big idea here is shifting from either or to get to both and. The second is thinking about how to apply, engage, embrace this both and approach, which it starts with, changing our mindsets, changing our questions, changing our thinking, but that's only the starting point. And in the book, we build out from these last 25 years of research that it's not just our mindsets, but it's also how we emotionally engage. It's how we create the scaffolding around us and our organization. It's how we enable the dynamics. So we go into depth in that. So it's how we do that. And then I think the third big idea, and this is sort of taking a complex idea and complicating it more, is that we sort of repeat multiple times in the book that navigating paradox is paradoxical. This is an idea, I know you're in Ann Arbor, that we got from our colleagues, Kim Cameron and Bob Quinn, who started writing about paradox, who are at the University of Michigan, started writing about paradox long before we did, and whose ideas we build on. But navigating paradox is paradoxical. And what we mean by that is that the tools to be able to embrace both and are themselves competing tools, right? So it's both our head and our hearts, cognition and emotion, rational and intuition. We've got to build those together. It's building a system where we have some stable structures that support us to enable both and, things like having boundaries and guardrails that keep us from going too far in either direction, but also being dynamic and enabling change and having practices for experimentation. So our third big point in the book is that navigating paradox is paradoxical. This isn't for the faint of heart, but we're all in it together. So.
Right. I like that. It's kind of a Zen thing, that navigating paradoxes is paradoxical in itself. But actually, what you're doing is you're speaking truth to the issue, and you're admitting that, hey, it's not easy. But what is easier to get our head around is the concept of both and versus either or. So that is a tangible concept. So we are racing toward the end of our show, Wendy. And as you know, I ask every guest a question about grace. Do you have one that you would like to share with us?
I love that question. I love the concept of grace, of being able to forgive yourself, forgive others, be able to. And so here's what it made me think of. Marianne Lewis, my co-author, and I often talk about the paradox of knowledge, which is the more you know you don't know. And so you're in that ongoing, and so much, I was thinking about the story of so much of our work in writing this book was living into that reality. We would get deeper and deeper into ideas, think that we've got it, and we've got a model that brings it all together and it makes so much sense, and then it would all slip away. And then we would get back on, this, and deepen our understanding of these ideas, and then it would all slip away. And that's been so much of our process of the research we've done together. And certainly writing this book was, the more we know about these ideas, about the book writing process, about how to bring these very abstract philosophical ideas to life for people, the more we knew we didn't know, and we had to live in the grace of accepting that.
Well, what a wonderful story. And the more we know, the more we need to know, and recognizing that and acting upon that as an act of humility, and which is nurtured by grace. So, Wendy, this is a wonderful conversation and one to ponder and to think about. And Tom Peters, in his endorsement of you, talked about don't skim this book, but savor it, every line. And he credited you for your extensive research too. So this is a thought-provoking book. So thank you for doing it. How can people find you, Wendy?
Yes. Well, John, thank you. And I hope people do. I have the book right here. So I hope that it's useful to people. We look forward to the feedback on the book. They can find the book at bothandthinking.net. They can find me at University of Delaware, and we welcome, and online on social media, on LinkedIn and Twitter. So we welcome feedback for sure.
Great. Wendy, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. And with that, I will close out.